In the first months of 1942, the map of the Pacific seemed to tilt in Japan's favor. The rising sun stretched across a swollen empire, its crimson rays covering Burma, Malaya, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and the Solomon Islands. On paper, Japan's victories looked permanent: oil from Borneo, rubber from Malaya, tin and bauxite from the Indies, and food from the Philippines. Yet beneath the glow of triumph lay the single thread that bound the empire together: shipping. Japan was an island nation with an industrial core that depended on imports. Its fleet of merchant vessels, about 6 million gross tons at the start of the war, carried everything from oil drums and rice sacks to copper ore and machine parts. Without these lifelines, Tokyo's military conquests would starve. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto knew it. So did the Japanese Army General Staff. But they assumed the sea lanes could be protected, and above all, that night itself was their shield. The United States Navy faced this reality with frustration. In 1942, the Pacific Fleet's submarine arm was plagued by faulty torpedoes. The Mark 14 detonators failed more often than not, turning daring patrols into wasted hunts. The carrier groups, after the costly victories at Coral Sea and Midway, could not spare aircraft for the daily grind of convoy chasing. Land-based bombers from the South Pacific were powerful in daylight but blind after sunset. And still the convoys crept out of Rabaul, Shortland Harbor, and Truk, steaming silently under the stars toward Guadalcanal or New Guinea. What the Navy had was a handful of ungainly flying boats, the consolidated PBY Catalina. It was already considered an anachronism, a high-winged amphibian, lumbering at 100 knots cruise, a target for any Japanese Zero lucky enough to catch it. Yet the Catalina had what nothing else did: legs. It could stay aloft for 20 hours, cross 2,500 miles of open sea, and loiter over a convoy lane until its crew was half asleep from engine drone. The question in late 1942 was simple: could this outdated aircraft be turned into a predator? In the humid tents of Espiritu Santo and Guadalcanal, the answer began to take shape. Crews started painting their Catalinas in matte black, stripping off the gleaming aluminum that glinted under moonlight. They covered instrument panels with red filters, taped flashlights in cockpits to keep vision intact, and carried grease pencils to jot bearings on perspex windows. A few technicians experimented with radar sets borrowed from the British, bulky, temperamental machines with glowing cathode tubes and ranges that flickered unpredictably between 5 and 20 miles. Commander Clarence Taffy Howard of Patrol Squadron 12 put it bluntly in a 1943 briefing: "Gentlemen, if we can see them in the dark, we can kill them in the dark. And if we kill them in the dark, the Imperial Navy can't fight in the light." Japanese doctrine gave them false confidence. Convoys hugged coasts by day, relying on naval patrols and air cover, then pushed through open water at night, convinced that darkness was safety. Lookouts strained their eyes against the horizon, but no radar screens glowed on Japanese bridges. The Imperial Navy had radar, but only in limited numbers, and almost never assigned to merchantmen. The idea that slow American flying boats could creep up at midnight seemed absurd. But by early 1943, it was not absurd. It was happening. The first reports filtered into Japanese war diaries in January. A freighter bound for New Guinea claimed to have been stalked at night by an invisible plane. Another convoy lost a tanker in sudden flames. No witnesses, no warning, only wreckage drifting at dawn. Allied records from 13 fighter command debriefings note similar mysteries. PBY made radar contact with unknown shipping. 3 hours later, fire observed on horizon. No enemy aircraft sighted. The Black Cats, as the crews began to call themselves, were being born. Their world was not glamorous. 12 to 14 men crammed into the cavernous fuselage, wrapped in flight jackets against the cold. The smell of hydraulic oil and sweat mingled with the tang of salt spray that crept in through hatches. Hours passed with only the soft ping of the radar operator calling out bearings: contact, 12 miles, bearing 020, closing. Engines would throttle back until the Catalina hung almost motionless over the water, drifting closer, unseen. The Japanese would not realize it for months, but the night, their shield, was gone. By February 1943 the experiment had become a campaign. Patrol Squadron 12, operating out of Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides, took delivery of freshly painted Catalinas, their silver skins turned into dull shadows by barrels of lampblack mixed with fuel oil. The crews did the work themselves, splattering paint under palm trees, smearing every reflective surface. They blackened propeller hubs, turrets, even the wing struts. When the tropical sun set, the PBYs vanished into the darkness. The transformation was not only cosmetic. Crews stripped away every ounce of weight they could spare, extra radios, benches, survival gear. They flew with minimum ammunition, a single .50 caliber in the waist blister, sometimes carrying depth charges or 500-pound bombs slung under the wings. Engineers improvised blackout curtains for the cockpit and taped over gauges with thin filters. The Catalina had never been designed for stealth, but it was being reshaped into a night raider. The key was radar. Early sets, ASV Mark II, later APS-2, were awkward, fragile machines, requiring dedicated operators to read their jittering scopes. The heart of the system was a cathode ray tube, glowing sickly green, showing arcs and blips against the noise of the sea. A skilled operator could spot a vessel 15 miles out, track its course, and guide the pilot in with whispered bearings. It was the first time in the Pacific that American airmen could truly see in the dark. One crewman recalled in a post-war interview how the new missions felt. You sat there with the black ocean stretching forever, and then, on that little screen, a shape appeared. You knew it was real even before your eyes saw a thing. That's when you realized we were ghosts to them. We could find them, but they couldn't find us. Japanese doctrine had not prepared for this. Convoys slipped out of Rabaul or truck after dusk, straining engines for 8 hours of black water transit. They assumed Allied planes could not hunt without the sun. Naval lookouts, often conscripted fishermen, scanned the horizon until their eyes watered. The Imperial Navy's few radar sets were hoarded for capital ships. Merchant skippers were left with lanterns and compasses. To them, the night was a blanket of safety. The Black Cats began proving otherwise. In March 1943 a Catalina prowling off Bougainville tracked a convoy of 4 freighters and 2 destroyers. The pilot throttled down to 90 knots, engines barely turning over, while the radar operator counted off range. When they were within half a mile, the crew dropped flares. The sudden white light stunned the Japanese column. Seconds later, bombs crashed into the water among the transports. The convoy scattered, its escorts firing blindly into the dark, while the Catalina lumbered away unharmed. Each success carried weight far beyond the tonnage destroyed. Reports from Japanese 4th Air Group diaries describe crews whispering about black planes that appeared without warning. At first they dismissed them as accidents, unlucky coincidences. But by summer, merchant captains spoke openly of cursed routes, of invisible attackers who stalked their convoys. For the men inside the Catalinas, the strain was real. Missions lasted up to 18 hours. They launched at sunset, circled over target waters through the night, then limped home after dawn, engines coughing. Inside the fuselage the air was sticky and sour, condensation dripped from metal frames, soaking uniforms. Fatigue gnawed at the crew, but adrenaline spiked. Whenever the radar blip appeared, every man knew that a searchlight or a zero at daybreak meant near certain death. The PBY was simply too slow to run. And yet they returned, night after night. By mid-1943, squadrons in the Solomons had sunk or damaged dozens of Japanese ships, from lumbering tankers to nimble gunboats. The Navy's official communiques downplayed the role of the Catalinas, but within the fleet they had already earned a nickname whispered with respect, the Black Cats. The Japanese would not admit it yet, but the night was no longer theirs. By April 1943 the transformation was complete. The Pacific night no longer belonged to Japan. Allied command began receiving daily reports of convoys mauled by slow, ungainly aircraft that were supposed to be obsolete. What changed wasn't the Catalina's airframe, it was the flickering green eye mounted inside its fuselage. The air-to-surface vessel radar, APS-2, looked primitive compared to the sleek electronics of later decades, but in 1943 it was revolutionary. The antennae, long Yagi booms jutting from the wings and nose, made the planes appear insect-like against the sky. Operators sat hunched over cathode ray tubes, headphones pressed tight, deciphering faint arcs of light. Every sweep of the beam revealed shadows of ships that no lookout could see. The science had leapt forward in secrecy. British labs had pioneered centimetric radar, American engineers had refined it. The Catalina became its unexpected chariot. The aircraft could loiter for hours, moving just fast enough to cover wide swaths of sea, slow enough that the fragile electronics could be carefully tuned. A destroyer or freighter gave off a stronger pulse than a speck of fishing boat, and the trained ear of an operator learned to tell the difference. Japanese sailors never saw it coming. Convoys leaving Truk believed they had 6, even 8 hours of safety before dawn patrols. They blacked out every lamp, smoked cigarettes under blankets, ordered engines throttled to low revolutions. Still, the Americans found them. A Catalina orbiting at 3,000 feet might appear only as a whispering drone in the distance. Then came the flare, a magnesium bomb descending on a parachute, lighting the sea in an awful white glare. Minutes later, explosions followed, bombs or torpedoes tearing through transports. The 13 Fighter Command's April 1943 debriefs recorded the astonishment of Japanese prisoners interrogated after convoy disasters. They spoke of phantom planes that see in the dark, a phrase that surfaced repeatedly in captured diaries. One diary from the 4th Air Group described morale collapsing after successive sinkings. The Americans have eyes at night. We are naked on the ocean. For the crews inside the Black Cats, the process became ritual. The pilot kept the Catalina low, throttled back, listening to the radar operator's steady cadence, 10 miles, bearing starboard, 6 miles, 4 miles, range closing. When the blip steadied, the bombardier armed the racks. Sometimes they dropped a pattern of 500-pounders across a column of transports. Other times they shadowed a convoy for hours, radioing positions to submarines and surface ships, a new model of coordinated night warfare. The results piled up. In June 1943 alone, Black Cat squadrons claimed more than 20,000 tons of Japanese shipping sunk or damaged. Official Navy tallies, drawn from patrol squadron records and later confirmed by post-war ATIS translations, showed a steady rise: small coal carriers, troop transports, oil tankers, all victims of aircraft Japan had dismissed as clumsy flying boats. The Japanese response was frantic but ineffective. Destroyers began firing starshells at random, wasting ammunition on empty seas. Merchant captains begged for radar sets, but Japan's limited production went to fleet carriers and battleships. Some convoys tried zigzag courses, others hugged coastlines, but the Black Cats hunted them anyway. By autumn, Tokyo's naval planners conceded privately that the supply routes into Rabaul and Bougainville were untenable under current conditions. Still, for every success, there was risk. Catalina slumbered at barely 110 knots in attack runs, easy prey for even the oldest Zero if daylight caught them. Crews returned from missions with bullet holes in wings, engines coughing from overstress. At Guadalcanal's Henderson Field, ground crews patched holes with sheet metal and sent the planes out again that evening. They had no choice, the radar sets were too scarce to sit idle. One pilot wrote in a 1943 letter preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency, "We know we are flying targets in daylight. But in the dark, with the radar humming in the sea below, it feels like we're the only hunters on Earth. The Japs can't hide from us. That's what keeps us going." By late 1943, Japanese commanders stopped promising safe passage at night. The phrase spread among Allied aircrews, "The cats own the darkness." By the summer of 1943, the Japanese supply lines into the central and northern Solomons had become death traps. What Tokyo described as logistics corridors looked, from the American perspective, like a shooting gallery. Every convoy dispatched from Rabaul or Truk carried troops, ammunition, rice, and fuel that Japan's forward garrisons desperately needed. Every convoy also carried a ticking clock. If they sailed at night, they risked the Black Cats. If they sailed by day, they faced carrier aircraft or B-25 strafers. The Japanese Navy tried everything to preserve its arteries. Destroyers raced the Tokyo Express down the slot, darting between islands at 30 knots, engines straining, wakes foaming behind them. Smaller merchantmen traveled in tight groups, their decks piled with drums of aviation fuel lashed down with rope. Escorts fired sporadically into the dark, convinced that American planes lurked just beyond sight. Yet the pattern of disaster only deepened. 13 fighter commands debriefs from April through July 1943 read like a ledger of attrition. One Catalina ambushed a convoy off New Georgia, dropping 4 500-pound bombs that turned a troopship into a sheet of flame visible for miles. Another Black Cat trailed a tanker for 3 hours before guiding in a wolf pack of submarines that finished the kill. At Bougainville, a PBY radar operator recorded tracking 6 separate convoys in 1 month, 4 were successfully attacked. Captured Japanese records confirm the nightmare. The 4th Air Group War Diary for July 1943 describes convoys leaving Rabaul with 6,000 men aboard and arriving at Bougainville with half that number. Losses severe, morale shaken, enemy aircraft appear suddenly at night was the refrain scribbled by weary staff officers. Survivors told interrogators after the war that some sailors simply refused to board night convoys, convinced they were sailing to certain death. The tactical shock lay not in the Catalina's weapons, they carried only modest bomb loads, but in their persistence. A PBY could remain aloft for 15 or 18 hours, gliding at 120 knots, methodically sweeping search arcs with its radar. Once a convoy was located, the options multiplied: attack directly with bombs or depth charges, shadow until dawn and hand targets to fast fighters, or radio positions to submarines lurking ahead. The Catalina had become less a strike aircraft and more an airborne command post of destruction. Japanese escorts tried deception. Some ships rigged false running lights, hoping to lure Catalinas into bombing empty sea. Others ordered their men to burn oily rags and drums, creating smoke screens that drifted across the water. But the radar pierced these tricks. The green phosphorescent sweep showed the steel hull beneath the ploy. "You cannot lie to the scope," one operator recalled. American tonnage reports tell the scale. Between April and September 1943, Black Cat squadrons alone accounted for more than 50,000 tons of Japanese shipping sunk or heavily damaged. Post-war Japanese shipping loss records compiled by Addis corroborate these figures almost exactly. For Tokyo, the calculus became brutal. Every transport lost meant entire battalions starved of food, fuel, and ammunition. By October, Japanese High Command admitted in internal memoranda that convoy survival rate to Solomons is unsustainable. For Allied planners, the consequences were immense. Guadalcanal had been saved, New Georgia was falling, Bougainville would be next. Each offensive step rested on the erosion of Japanese resupply. It was not just Marines and infantry that defeated Japan's forward bases, it was the slow, grinding, nocturnal hunt of aircraft painted black, flying low and steady with radar eyes. Crews knew the strain. They launched at sunset, throttled through humid nights, then landed after dawn with nerves shot and bodies drained. But they also knew each destroyed freighter was one less week of rice for the garrisons, one less load of fuel for the Zero squadrons. "We weren't glamorous like the fighter boys," a pilot said decades later at the 1985 Veterans Reunion, "but we strangled the enemy while they slept." By late 1943, even Japanese admirals whispered the truth in war diaries: the Black Cats owned the night sea lanes. By autumn of 1943 the Allied advance pressed northward with steady inevitability, and Rabaul, the once proud fortress hub of the Japanese South Pacific Empire, found itself under siege. With 5 airfields, hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, and thousands of dug-in troops, Rabaul was never stormed directly. Instead, it was starved, its arteries severed night after night by the Black Cats. Rabaul depended on the sea. Every sack of rice, every barrel of aviation fuel, every reinforcement battalion had to travel by convoy. Destroyers that once raced the Tokyo Express now spent themselves in fruitless escort duty. Merchantmen crept into Simpson Harbor under cover of darkness, but the darkness no longer belonged to Japan. Black Cat squadrons, operating from Tulagi, Guadalcanal, and later Bougainville, extended their reach. Their PBY-5s flew missions lasting 18 hours, crews surviving on thermos coffee and stale sandwiches. Pilots described the monotony of endless black water interrupted by jolts of adrenaline when the radar scope lit up with telltale green blips, Japanese ships moving in line. It was like seeing ghosts walk into the room, one operator remembered, except we could kill them. Convoy after convoy paid the price. On the night of October 7, 1943, two Catalinas shadowed a formation of freighters bound for Rabaul, relaying position updates to B-25 Mitchells waiting at dawn. The result was catastrophic: 2 transports sunk, 1 destroyer crippled, hundreds of Japanese troops drowned. Another Black Cat raid in November dropped mines into Simpson Harbor itself, forcing ships to anchor outside the protective ring of guns, perfect prey for submarines and daylight bombers. Captured Japanese records after the war leave no doubt about the effect. The 4th Air Group's diary for November lamented supply arrivals less than half requirement, fuel shortage acute. One officer scrawled a despairing note, enemy night planes impossible to prevent. Convoys vanish. The phrasing was stark, vanish, as if swallowed whole. Allied intelligence confirmed the strangulation. U.S. Navy estimates in late 1943 concluded that only 15% of Japanese shipping dispatched from truck to Rabaul arrived unscathed. The rest fell victim to submarines, carrier strikes, or, more and more often, the prowling Catalinas. A logistics artery that once pulsed with lifeblood had become a bleeding wound. By January 1944 the consequences were visible on the ground. Japanese Zero squadrons at Rabaul flew fewer sorties, starved of aviation fuel. Soldiers rationed their rice, supplementing with taro roots dug from village plots. Ammunition grew scarce, artillery batteries drilled with empty guns. Interrogated officers after the war admitted they understood the fortress could not last. "We were buried alive," one said at the 1962 U.ESTA Japanese Aviation Symposium. Yet still the Black Cats came. They circled Rabaul's approaches, black holes blending into the night sky. Crews grew expert at inserting mines, laying them with quiet precision at harbor mouths. When convoys attempted to slip through by hugging coastlines, radar tracked them anyway. "They could not hide in shadows," said one veteran at the 1985 reunion. "We were the shadows." Even Japanese admirals, long schooled in offensive spirit, conceded the truth. Naval records captured after the war reveal a grim calculation: Rabaul's position was untenable not because its guns were destroyed, but because its stomach was empty. Without supplies, even the strongest fortress crumbles. The Black Cats had proven that destruction did not always roar in daylight or blaze with tracers. Sometimes it crept on slow wings, painting the ocean with invisible beams, and left burning ships behind as the only sign it had passed. By the start of 1944, Rabaul was effectively strangled. The fortress still stood, its guns still lined the ridges, but the arteries had been cut. The PBYs, ungainly, slow, mocked at the war's beginning, had become one of the decisive tools in the Allied strategy of isolation. In the Pacific, Japan's empire had been built on shipping lanes. Now those same lanes belonged to the night hunters. The Pacific night in 1944 was no longer simply darkness, it was contested territory. Radar had transformed it into an arena where invisible beams measured the ocean, where the edge of survival hinged on who could see first. The Black Cats had been among the earliest American squadrons to employ airborne radar operationally, and their quiet success forced Japan into a radar war it was unprepared to fight. American technicians, working with British-designed ASV, air-to-surface vessel, sets, refined the gear for the PBYs. Operators huddled in the cabin over glowing scopes, headphones clamped tight, tracing echoes that revealed convoys far beyond human sight. At first, many crews mistrusted the technology, but after their first confirmed kill, bombs landing squarely on a freighter they never saw with the naked eye, the skepticism vanished. "It was like turning on the lights in a black room," one crewman said later. The Japanese had no equivalent system at sea in 1942 or 1943. Their escorts relied on sharp eyes, listening devices, and searchlights, all of which failed against radar-directed hunters. Even when Japan began fitting crude air warning radar on a handful of ships in 1943, the sets were primitive, often plagued by interference or limited range. Worse still, operators lacked training. Allied post-war interrogations revealed that many Japanese officers distrusted the devices, believing the machines were unreliable compared to human watchstanders. That cultural hesitation proved fatal. By early 1944, Japan attempted countermeasures. Convoys zigzagged erratically, hoping to break radar locks. Some commanders ordered radio silence so American direction finding could not pin them down. Others experimented with dispersal, sending ships singly rather than in groups. But these measures backfired. Dispersed ships were easier prey for submarines, and zigzagging only slowed arrival times, leaving convoys longer at sea. "We fought the enemy in mathematics we could not solve," admitted a former Japanese navigator at the 1962 symposium. Meanwhile, Allied innovation accelerated. Black Cats were upgraded with improved radar sets and Lee lights, powerful search lamps slung under the wing that could suddenly illuminate a target at close range. Borrowed from British anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic, the technique was terrifying at sea. A convoy steaming in moonless night might suddenly be bathed in blinding white light as bombs splashed seconds later. Survivors remember the shock. The invisible hunter revealed itself only in the instant of attack. The Japanese scrambled for answers. Naval engineers tested rudimentary radar detectors meant to pick up American emissions, but these were few and finicky. A handful of night fighters were stationed at Rabaul and Truk, but they were too scarce and too vulnerable to surprise strikes. Post-war interrogation reports describe one pilot's bitter admission: "We were blind men chasing ghosts." The statistics bore out the imbalance. Between January and June 1944, Black Cat squadrons flew nearly 900 missions, locating more than 400 Japanese ships and claiming dozens sunk or crippled. Losses to enemy night fighters were negligible. Radar simply gave too great an advantage. The Japanese began to change convoy tactics in desperation, dispatching more barges and small craft to shuttle supplies between islands, hoping their low radar signatures would avoid detection. But the Catalinas adapted again. Radar operators grew skilled at distinguishing faint echoes, and crews learned to follow wakes that glimmered under moonlight. In one 13-fighter command debrief, a PBY described chasing a line of barges for hours, dropping flares and depth charges until the sea was littered with wreckage. By mid-1944 the radar war was no contest. Japan lagged too far behind in technology and production, while the Allies multiplied their advantage with training, doctrine, and sheer numbers. The Black Cats had proven that radar was not just a tool but a weapon, every bit as decisive as guns or bombs. In later years, historians at the National World War II Museum called it a revolution at sea under cover of darkness. For the Japanese, it was more personal. One officer, reflecting during a 1945 interrogation, said, "We never feared your daylight raids as much as your night ones. The night should have been our ally. You stole it from us." The radar beams had rewritten the map of war. The Pacific's black waters no longer hid Japan's lifelines, they betrayed them. When the war was over, the technology could be displayed in museums, the statistics filed in archives, and the battle maps traced with colored pencils across clean tables. But what endured most vividly were the voices of the men who lived those nights, both the Americans who flew the Catalinas and the Japanese sailors who endured the convoys. Their testimonies, gathered over decades, in 13-fighter command debriefs, in U.S. Navy oral histories, in post-war Japanese interrogation reports, and at veteran reunions, form the most human part of the story. A PBY pilot from the 339th Squadron remembered his first radar contact. "I was 23 years old, sweating in a cockpit that smelled like oil and coffee. The operator called out, 'Contact, 7 miles, bearing 090. I couldn't see a thing. Just black sea. Then the bombs went out, and the water turned orange fire. I realized the machine was showing us what the human eye could not. That was the night I began to trust radar more than I trusted myself.'" For Japanese sailors, the same moment often meant confusion and terror. One survivor of a troopship sunk off Bougainville recalled in a 1946 Allied interrogation that the night was calm, the moon gone. Suddenly there was a thunder from above, and the sea boiled. We had no warning. No plane seen. It felt like death fell out of empty air. Catalina crews described the peculiar exhaustion of their missions. Take off at sunset, 12 to 18 hours in the air, landing after dawn with muscles stiff and eyes burning. A radioman told the National World War II Museum that the plane vibrated constantly, and your ears rang from the engines. But you learned to catnap between radar calls. The hardest part was not falling asleep on the way home. We joked that we were the slowest planes in the Pacific, but we flew the longest hours. Bombardiers told of improvisation. The PBY was not built as a night attack aircraft, and its armament was modest. We had 4 bombs, one crewman said at the 1985 reunion in Hawaii, and everyone had to count. You aimed by instinct, sometimes by the spark of a cigarette on a freighter deck, sometimes by radar echo. You learned to be patient. If you missed, you circled for another try, knowing the gunners below were waiting for you. Japanese convoy gunners had their own perspective. A diary recovered from the 4th Air Group described standing on deck, firing blind into the night sky at the sound of engines. We put up tracers, hoping to frighten them, but the enemy never showed himself until the explosion. It was like shooting at ghosts. Another officer admitted after the war that the psychological toll was worse than the physical damage. You could prepare for daylight attack. You could see the planes coming. But at night you only waited, not knowing when or from where. Even among Americans, there was ambivalence. The Catalinas lacked glamour compared to P-38s or carrier fighters. We were not aces, one veteran said. Nobody painted kill tallies on a PBY. But we knew that without us, the Marines on those islands would have starved or bled harder. Their reward was not fame but the quiet satisfaction of knowing their missions mattered. One pilot recalled a moment of horror when his bombs struck a transport. We circled back, and the ship was burning from bow to stern. We saw men in the water, hundreds of them. We couldn't help. Our orders were clear: don't linger, don't risk the plane. So we left them. I still see their faces, lit by the flames. I did my duty, but I wonder if those men curse me in their graves. Japanese testimonies echo that bitterness. A naval officer at the 1962 U.ESTA Japanese Aviation History Symposium admitted that many Japanese came to dread the very sound of American planes at night. We were raised to believe night was the realm of the Imperial Navy. Yet your black cats made us feel hunted even in our strongholds. It was a humiliation more profound than defeat in daylight. And yet there was respect, too. Several Japanese officers spoke of grudging admiration for the persistence of the Catalinas. They flew like tortoises, yet they were always there, one said. We felt they never tired, never ceased. For the Americans, camaraderie was their shield against exhaustion. Crews of 7 or 8 men became families. You lived together, ate together, fought together, said one gunner. There was no rank inside that fuselage, not when you had to pass sandwiches forward while the pilot sweated over the stick. If one man failed, we all died. That made us close. Their humor masked fear. They painted sharks, bats, and cartoon cats on the black fuselages. They named planes after sweethearts or inside jokes. One Catalina bore the name Nightmare. Another was christened Bad Penny, because it always seemed to turn up over Japanese convoys. These little rituals gave identity to the long, anonymous nights. Even decades later, the memories had not faded. At the 1985 Veterans Reunion, old men with gray hair and thick glasses embraced like brothers, trading stories of oil leaks, radar contacts, and lucky escapes. One recalled the time a PBY landed on a rough sea to rescue downed aviators, then barely staggered into the air with extra weight aboard. Another remembered a Japanese convoy lit up by moonlight, like ducks in a row, until the bombs fell and turned the sea into fire. Japanese veterans, too, reflected with candor. We did not hate the men in those planes, one said in translation. We hated what they did to us. but we respected their courage. They flew slowly, in the dark, into our guns. That took bravery. Many of us did not expect to survive each convoy, and often we did not. These voices, fearful, proud, haunted, reveal the war's most enduring truth, that beyond statistics of tonnage sunk or convoys destroyed were men caught in the machine. For the Black Cat crews, the war was a series of long nights broken by sudden moments of fire and death. For the Japanese sailors, it was dread unbroken, waiting for an unseen enemy to strike from the dark. Technology may explain the outcome, but memory explains the cost. By the end of 1944, the Catalinas were already being replaced by faster, more advanced patrol planes. Yet for those who lived through the dark nights of 1942 and 1943, the slow, lumbering PBY painted black had already earned its place in history, and in memory. When historians look back at the Pacific War, it is often the grand battles that dominate the story: Midway with its flaming carriers, Guadalcanal with its desperate jungle fighting, Leyte Gulf with its sprawling clash of fleets. Yet war is rarely decided by spectacle alone. The Black Cats, their ungainly Catalinas cloaked in black paint, remind us that decisive power sometimes comes from persistence, patience, and the quiet mastery of technology. Their legacy extends beyond the ships they sank or the convoys they scattered. It reaches into how nations understood the very nature of modern war. In the months after Rabaul's isolation, Allied commanders recognized what the Catalinas had demonstrated: control of supply routes could destroy a fortress without firing a single shot at its walls. Rabaul was never stormed. Its airfields, bunkers, and harbor defenses remained formidable until Japan's surrender in 1945. But cut off from resupply, the garrison withered. Troops starved. Aircraft sat idle for lack of fuel. The mighty bastion became a hollow shell, bypassed and irrelevant. Strategists at the Naval War College later called it a classic case of logistical strangulation, and they pointed directly to the Black Cats as pioneers of that strategy. The legacy also lived in technology. Radar, once dismissed by some pilots as untrustworthy, became central to naval and air operations. The Catalinas had been among the first U.S. squadrons to prove airborne radar could change the battlefield. Their operators learned to interpret faint echoes, to distinguish between wave clutter and steel holes, to vector attacks based on invisible information. That experience fed into the development of more advanced patrol aircraft, from the PB-4Y Privateer to the post-war P-2V Neptune. When the Cold War dawned, American naval aviation carried radar as standard, because the Black Cats had shown what it could do. For Japan, the lessons were harsher. Post-war interrogations reveal a recognition that failure to invest in radar, and failure to train crews in its use, doomed their convoys. Officers admitted they had underestimated the Allies' capacity for night operations. One naval engineer wrote in 1946, "We prepared for daylight battle. We did not prepare for radar. This was our blindness." The words echo with tragic clarity. A nation that had built its empire on mastery of the seas had been undone by technology it dismissed too long. Culturally, the Black Cats carried a quieter legacy. Their work never attracted the headlines of carrier battles or the romance of fighter aces. PBYs were slow, homely, and anonymous. Few films glorified them. Yet among veterans, the pride remained undimmed. At the 1985 Pacific Theater reunion in Hawaii, men who had flown in the dark, who had leaned over glowing radar scopes, gathered to share memories. Some laughed about coffee gone cold on 12-hour flights, others admitted they still dreamed of burning ships at sea. What united them was the knowledge that their contribution, while unsung, had been decisive. Museums today try to honor that story. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum preserves examples of the PBY, explaining to visitors how its radar helped reverse the tide in the Solomons. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans tells the tale of convoys that vanished in the night, undone by aircraft painted black. Exhibits highlight the technical ingenuity of mounting ASV radar in an amphibious patrol bomber, and the courage of crews who flew 18-hour missions into hostile skies. For younger generations, it is often the first time they realize that victory did not belong only to the fast and glamorous, but also to the slow and relentless. Even Japanese voices have entered the legacy. At the 1962 U.ESTA Japanese Aviation Symposium, former convoy officers spoke candidly about their fear of the Catalinas. One said, "We expected submarines. We expected daylight bombers. We did not expect night to betray us." His words were recorded, translated, and archived, offering a poignant acknowledgement that the Black Cats had reshaped enemy perception. What had once been Japan's domain, the night sea lanes, was stolen from them. The statistics endure as proof. U.S. Navy records credit Black Cat squadrons with sinking or damaging over 100,000 tons of Japanese shipping. Post-war Japanese loss reports align closely. But numbers alone cannot capture the psychological weight. For Japanese sailors, every night voyage became a gamble against unseen hunters. For American crews, every mission demanded stamina, skill, and nerve. That shared human strain is part of the legacy as well. After the war, many Catalinas were scrapped, their black paint faded under tropical sun. Some returned to civilian life, converted into cargo haulers or fire bombers. A few survived into the jet age, relics of a time when a lumbering flying boat could tip the balance of a theater. For veterans, each surviving airframe carries ghosts, of comrades lost, of convoys destroyed, of nights when radar blips meant life or death. The legacy also lies in doctrine. Modern naval warfare embraces the principle that supply lines are the true arteries of war, that strangling an enemy's logistics can be more effective than storming their strongholds. In the Pacific, that principle began not with fleets clashing in daylight, but with Catalinas prowling through darkness. Today, military academies still cite Rabaul's isolation as a lesson in indirect strategy, proof that sometimes the best way to win a battle is never to fight it head-on. For the men themselves, legacy was personal. One Black Cat veteran said in an interview near the end of his life, "We were never glamorous. Nobody remembers the Catalinas like they do the Mustangs or the Carriers. But we were there every night, and we broke the back of the Japanese supply lines. That was our victory." His voice, recorded and archived, carries the weight of quiet pride. And perhaps that is the most fitting legacy of all. The Black Cats did not roar like tigers. They prowled, patient and unseen, turning night into a weapon. They proved that persistence could rival power, that technology could outmatch tradition, and that the slowest plane in the fleet could sometimes cast the longest shadow. Japan never expected radar to hunt their convoys all night. But history remembers that it did, and that in those long, dark hours over the Pacific, the course of a war was changed. The Black Cats faded quietly into history, their story overshadowed by more glamorous machines and larger battles. Yet their influence endured in every convoy protected, every fortress starved, and every night sailors whispered fear of unseen wings. They had proved that technology, courage, and persistence could remake the rules of war. By 1945, radar was no longer experimental, it was essential. American fleets, bombers, and patrol squadrons relied on it as naturally as engines or fuel. The Catalinas had been among the first to show how invisible signals could decide visible outcomes. Their patient hours in darkness created the foundation for the modern age of electronic warfare. For Japan, the lesson was carved in loss. Post-war officers admitted that their nation had underestimated radar, underestimated the reach of American industry, and underestimated the quiet resolve of aircrews who would fly until their fuel ran out and then fly again the next night. Convoys that had once been the Empire's lifeline became a graveyard of steel. The men who flew the Black Cats rarely boasted. They spoke of long nights, of coffee gone cold, of monotony punctuated by moments of fire. Many died without recognition, their work buried in classified reports and forgotten war diaries. Yet in their persistence lay a kind of heroism no less vital than the glory of great battles. History is not written only in explosions and victories, but in the slow grind of attrition, the quiet strangulation of supply, the relentless watch through midnight hours. The Black Cats understood this truth. They hunted until the empire they stalked could no longer move. In the end, Japan never expected radar to hunt convoys all night. That miscalculation shaped the outcome of a war, and left a legacy that endures in every doctrine of modern sea power.